We are in a war. This is a real war. The forces are good versus evil, light against dark. Last week, we began exploring the parable of the weeds, which is recorded in Matthew 13:24 through 30. We talked about how before we join the battle, we have to make certain that we are, in fact, good seed. If you missed it, I encourage you to listen to that episode before you move on to this one. Now, the parable of the weeds begins like this: The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. There's an important detail in the first line of this story that's easy to miss. And that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Brad Paquette, and this is the Company Podcast. So we're talking about the parable of the weeds, and I want to read it again for you. This comes from Matthew 13:24 through 30, and this is Jesus speaking. And he said, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" There's an important detail in the first line of that story, and it's so easy to gloss over as we jump to the main point of the story. Let me read that first line just one more time. It says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away." Did you hear it that time? When did the enemy plant the bad seed? While the servants were sleeping. While his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. I've noticed that sleeping is usually not a good thing in Jesus's parables. How many times in the Gospels does Jesus exhort us to stay awake and alert? So, for this next section, I'm going to need to be an old man for just a minute because I need to tell you about how the world is getting worse. I'll be 40 in July, so I think I'm earning my right to be an old man for just a minute. But this isn't a habit of mine. I generally try to maintain a positive and optimistic perspective about the world around us. But if we're going to understand our position in this war, if we're going to understand our strategy moving forward, we do have to be real about the status of that war and what that means for us. So, being almost 40, I did most of my growing up in the 90s. I remember my parents being really concerned about media and specifically TV when I was a kid. It felt like we weren't allowed to watch anything. In fact, my parents would do this thing where they would put the TV away for like weeks and months at a time. And in the 90s, at least our TV, we were probably a little bit behind the times, but our TV was like a big cabinet on wheels. And so they would wheel it into the closet under the stairs and close the door and leave it there. What they didn't know was that whenever they would leave, my older brothers would wheel it back out and watch whatever they wanted. And then when they heard the car coming in the driveway, they put it back in the closet really, really quick. But nonetheless, that was sort of the attitude around media in our house, was that there's some really dangerous stuff on TV. Nate Bargatze, which is he's a really good comedian and relatively clean. He has this joke in his newest special. He says, when they made The Simpsons, it was like, I guess they're just showing R-rated TV shows now. And that's what it was like for me too. The Simpsons were absolutely off limits in our household. And while then it seemed like, wow, this is really bad stuff that they're putting on TV, today they really are making R-rated TV shows. Honestly, it seems like almost every time that somebody recommends a show to me on a streaming platform like Netflix or Amazon Prime, within the first few scenes, there's nudity or graphic sexual content. For what it's worth, that's a red line for me. If a show is going to use that kind of content to try to promote itself, then I'm out. I just won't support something like that with my viewership. But that means that oftentimes it feels like I don't have very much to watch, and I really can't participate in a lot of the conversations people are having about what they're watching. And for what it's worth, I think that every generation since the beginning of time thinks that things have gotten worse since the time that they were a kid. Maybe that's just a part of growing up. John Wesley has this quote, though, and he says, "What one generation tolerates, the next generation will embrace." And that's also true. Because while every generation sort of has this gap that says, oh, things are so bad now compared to when I was a youngster, we also can't deny that we are seeing an unprecedented moral decline in America. Whatever the natural generational gap is between a child and his parents and what's acceptable behavior and the kind of language we use and things like that, we have seen a dramatic acceleration into moral decline in our present culture. And what I want to say is that it's all our fault. If we take the words of this parable seriously, I think by the results that we see, we can reasonably conclude that we have been asleep. And that's for all of us, but I'm mostly talking about my generation and the generation that preceded me. Now, for my part, I'm certain that it was my fault. I was absolutely asleep. Now God has really worked on my heart, and I do have these red lines of like, I won't watch content that does this thing or that thing, but that wasn't always the case. Through my 20s, I did my proportionate share of watching garbage on TV. I did my share of giving my money to companies that produce trash. And I would regularly recommend TV shows to people that support that kind of content. Now, I wasn't like a godless heathen, but even in the stuff that I was creating as a writer and an editor, rather than really submitting those gifts to God and using them in support of the calling that He placed on my life, I spent a fair portion of my 20s pushing the boundaries in all of the wrong ways. But, as we think about this generational decline that we see and just kind of the trajectory of American culture right now, I've taught before, and I still stand behind it, that we can't be mad at the world for being the world. What else would we expect them to be? That's why they're the world. That's why we call them the lost. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And I think that that should be our attitude towards the world as well. And instead of being mad at the world for how bonkers things have gotten, we need to instead face the truth. We failed to represent the kingdom in the American media. That's on us. We were asleep. And frankly, it was ours for the taking. We lost it. That's how hard and fast asleep we were. If you look back into the early part of the 20th century, even most secular books were written from a Christian worldview. I think John Steinbeck is a great example of this. He was a self-described agnostic, and John Steinbeck is a fantastic author. So many good books that he's written, but he was an agnostic, openly so. However, even despite having no evidence of being a believer in his life that I can see, his books are rife with biblical allusions and kingdom value. I mean, the title of one of his most famous books is East of Eden, which is a direct reference to the Garden of Eden. So even this secular author was writing from a kingdom perspective. If you read John Steinbeck's books, you're going to find a ton of kingdom value in there. Light versus darkness, the problem of sin in the world. These are the things that he talks about just by nature of the culture that he lived in. And that's what we inherited. It was all ours for our taking. But we fell asleep and the enemy invested. We fell asleep at the wheel and the enemy planted a whole lot of seed. While we were asleep, the enemy spent his time improving the entertainment mediums by every metric. We just coasted along and let it happen while the world's media got better and better and better. And values that were not our own were allowed to become entrenched in every aspect of our media. While this was happening, we complained. People in the church, we complained, we warned, and we ignored, but we didn't invest at all. And that's a shame. And I'm done being an old man now because we can't do anything about that. My rant about the state of society is over. That's the state of things. But at the same time, there's nothing we can do about it now, right? Generations past are generations past. It's disappointing to arrive where we are now and to know that we are asleep, but what's done is done. What we can do is answer the question for ourselves. Are we awake now? Are you awake now? Are you ready to sow good seed? Are you ready to watch the field in this generation and in this time? Paul exhorts us in his letter to the Ephesians. This is chapter 5, verses 11 through 17. He says, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, 'Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.' Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." And again, that's Ephesians 5, 11 through 17, if you want to check it out and read the context before and after that. But the theme of this passage, part of it is wake up. I love that line there. It says, "Awake, O sleeper." So that's part of my message for you today. Wake up, O sleeper. We have work to do. Now, if we read the whole parable, the parable of the weeds, we see that the weeds are not our responsibility. That's kind of the point. But what we can do is sow more good seed. What we can do is stay awake, be vigilant, and stop the enemy from dropping any more junk seed on our watch. And, I've been talking about generations, but I don't care how old you are. I don't care if you're a teenager listening to this. I don't care if you're in your retirement years. It doesn't matter. No matter how old you are, it is time to fully submit ourselves to the call of God in our lives. If God is calling you to be a part of the solution and to create better Christian media, the time is right now. The time is now to invest in ourselves as creators. Let's invest in better content that both shares the gospel overtly and content that tills the ground for future harvest. If we as kingdom creators carry the Holy Spirit, let's act like it. There should be no question of our ability to produce better, richer, deeper, more compelling, higher quality content than our secular counterparts. And I'm not saying that you'll be instantly gifted, to be the best that you can be. You'll need to invest in yourself. You'll need to excel in your craft in order to reach the mark that God is calling you to. But when you do that, when you recognize the Holy Spirit in your life, when you invest in yourself as a kingdom creator and begin to excel at your craft, when the Spirit says jump, you'll be ready. When the Spirit says jump, all you'll need is the courage to jump as high as you can. So will you stand up in this time? That's my question for you. Will you lead with me and sow good seed in this field? Generations past are generations past. We are where we are. But this is our time to play our part in the great kingdom story. Nap time is over. Thank you so much for listening today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen and leave us a review. This podcast was produced by Theo Paquette with help from the company. For help with your podcast, visit writers.company. We'd love to give you a hand.